Sometimes silence is louder than anger. It's not the kind of silence that follows a fight where words hang in the air, hot and sharp. No, this one is colder, older. It settles into the walls, into the creak of the stairs, into the space between two people who've stopped trying. That was what my marriage had become. A long, quiet ache that no one talked about anymore. Greg and I had been together 15 years, long enough to learn each other's habits, and long enough to stop being curious about them. He used to touch my back in the kitchen, lightly, just passing by. He used to kiss my shoulder when he thought I was asleep, but that was years ago. Now, the only thing he kissed was his phone screen when leaving for business trips, always in a rush, always with a suitcase, always with that vague guilt behind his eyes. "This won't be long," he'd say, and it never was, but it always felt long to me. I didn't resent him, not really. I think somewhere along the line, we just drifted, like two boats that once shared the same harbor but slowly floated out on different tides. We never had children, not for lack of trying. I miscarried twice. The second time was worse. I stopped painting after that. And Greg, he stopped coming home early. I had my books, my work at the library, my long walks along the pond behind our neighborhood, and then I had Noah. He moved in during the last week of October. The trees had just turned, and there was that crisp bite in the air that always made me nostalgic for something I could never name. I had posted the listing for the guest room online, mostly out of boredom. The house felt too quiet lately, too echoing. He arrived with a single suitcase and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Noah Reeve," he said. "I think I emailed you." He was polite, clean-cut, maybe late 20s. There was a softness to him, not weak, but careful, like someone who'd been taught to speak gently so the world wouldn't push back too hard. I showed him the converted unit out back. It had its own entrance, a kitchenette, and a small balcony that overlooked the garden. He nodded with appreciation at everything, even the chipped tile in the bathroom. "This is more than enough," he said, and he meant it. He paid the deposit in cash, said he was finishing his master's in psychology, needed a few months of quiet to write his thesis. I remember thinking, he came to the right place. We didn't talk much at first. He kept to himself, woke early, went for runs, read on the balcony with his headphones in, but he always smiled when we crossed paths, always said good morning like he actually meant it. That felt rare. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me, just for a moment too long, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, just present, noticing things my husband no longer did, the way I paused while making coffee, how I sat with my knees tucked up on the couch, the fact that I always lit one candle at dinner, even when I was alone. I tried not to think about it, but of course I did. One night, a week or so after he moved in, I stayed up late reading. I couldn't sleep. Greg had called to say his trip would be extended another 5 days. He didn't apologize this time. Just assumed I'd understand. I didn't argue. I never did. Around midnight, I stepped out into the backyard with a glass of wine. It was cold enough that I wrapped my robe tighter. The wind carried the scent of wet leaves and something faintly smoky, someone burning wood nearby. And then I saw Noah. He was on his balcony, hoodie pulled up, knees drawn to his chest, reading by the light of a tiny lamp. He didn't see me at first, but I watched him. He looked peaceful in a way that felt oddly out of place, like he didn't belong to this life, or maybe I didn't anymore. After a minute, he looked up and smiled. Neither of us said anything. He just lifted his glass, a silent cheers, and I did the same. Then I went back inside, heart beating a little faster than I cared to admit. I told myself I wouldn't open the second bottle. I had already poured one glass too many, but silence has a way of persuading you. Greg hadn't called, not even a message. He was in Portland this time. Something about a last-minute investor dinner. I wasn't even sure what his job entailed anymore, just that it took him away, often and always conveniently. I sat by the kitchen window, watching the frost creep in across the glass like tiny, patient fingers. One lamp lit the room in gold. Outside, the garden was bare, stripped by wind and time. I used to plant herbs there, basil, rosemary, lemon balm. Now it was just dirt and memory. I poured another glass. It was close to 11 when I heard the soft knock, not at the front door, but the side one, the one that led to the garden path and eventually to the guest unit. I opened it barefoot. Noah stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes a little unsure. "Sorry," he said. "I saw your light was on." He held something up, a small paper bag. "I made cookies," he added, almost shyly. I blinked. I hadn't been offered a cookie in years. It felt absurdly tender. "You made these?" He nodded. "Chocolate chip. Sort of my go-to when I can't sleep." I stepped aside. "Come in. I mean, if you're okay with a bit of wine and melancholy." He smiled softly. "Sounds like a Thursday night." We sat across from each other at the kitchen island. The light above us was dim, casting warm shadows across his face. He looked younger tonight, softer, or maybe I was just lonelier. "Do you always bake when you can't sleep?" I asked, fingers tracing the rim of my glass. "I bake when I don't want to think." He paused. "And run when I've already thought too much." That made me laugh, quiet and involuntary. Something loosened in me then, like a window cracking open after years of stale air. We talked about small things at first, the cold, his thesis, my job at the library. He was easy to listen to, gentle in how he spoke, like he didn't want to take up too much space but was grateful to be there. And I found myself talking more than I intended. I told him about the miscarriages, about how I stopped painting, about the version of myself I thought I'd grow into, but never did. He didn't flinch, didn't try to fix it, just listened. And then, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Does he know how much you miss her, the you before the grief?" The question struck something raw in me. I looked away, eyes stinging. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think he sees her anymore." We sat in that silence for a long beat. Then, so gently I almost didn't notice, he reached out and touched my hand. Not possessively, not suggestively, just presence. My breath caught. His fingers were warm. Mine were trembling. I should have pulled away. I should have said good night, but I didn't. We ended up in the living room. The wine was gone, the cookies half eaten. The record player spun something old and soft, something I used to play in college when I wanted to feel safe. I don't remember leaning against him, only that I did. His arm was around my shoulder, my cheek near the curve of his collarbone, his pulse steady beneath my skin. I remember whispering, "This feels like a memory I haven't had yet." And he whispered back, "Maybe it's one we both needed." There was no kiss, not that night, only breath and nearness and the ache of something beginning, something dangerous, something neither of us said out loud. It started with nothing, a glance, a brush of skin when passing the coffee mugs, but everything felt different, charged. I avoided looking at Noah that morning, the way I avoided my own reflection. He was polite, unassuming, said, "Thanks for the talk," and cookies are still on the counter, like nothing had changed. But we both knew something had. The air had. It followed me all day, in the way I rinsed the dishes, the way I lingered near the back door, a gravity that pulled me toward the guest house, even when I tried to resist. That weekend, Greg called, said he'd stay another few days. I didn't ask why. He used to bring me trinkets from trips, lavender soap, hotel pens, miniature jams. Now he just brought distance. That night I opened a bottle again, not out of sadness, out of knowing. I should have gone to bed early. Instead, I wandered to the hallway, paused in front of the guest house door. I knocked once, soft, and he opened, like he'd been waiting. We didn't speak much. I stepped in. He stepped back. The room smelled faintly of cedar and warm fabric softener. A book lay open on his bed. Miles Davis played low on a speaker by the window. He looked at me, really looked, and in that stillness I felt seen, not as someone's wife or a woman past her prime, but as me. "I shouldn't be here," I said. "I know. I don't want this to be a mistake." He hesitated, then said, voice trembling, then let it be something we don't lie about. And I broke, not from desire, but from recognition. The ache of being understood in a house where I'd felt invisible for years. We didn't rush. There was no frenzy, no tearing of clothes, just hands searching gently, just lips pausing with every breath like asking, "Are you sure?" It wasn't about the physical, it was about presence. Touch that didn't ask me to perform, eyes that didn't look through me. And when it was over, whatever it was, we lay there, quiet, skin against skin, breath against breath. Noah reached up and brushed my hair from my cheek, said nothing, and I cried, because for the first time in years, I felt alive. But morning comes like a verdict. I woke up to sunlight slicing through blinds and the weight of what we'd done. Noah was already up, a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked different in daylight, not wrong, just more real. I sat up slowly, sheet around me, heartbeat wild. "We crossed it," I whispered, "the line." He nodded, but not with regret, with quiet understanding. "I know. What now?" He took a sip, then looked at me. "You tell me." I didn't have an answer, because I was still wearing my wedding ring, and Greg was coming home in 2 days. But something inside me had shifted. A line had been crossed, but not just between Noah and me, between the life I endured and the life I'd momentarily tasted. And I couldn't unknow that. The day Greg came back, the weather turned. Gray clouds hovered low over the neighborhood like they were waiting for something to fall. Rain, a truth, maybe a choice. I changed the sheets, vacuumed the house twice, put on lipstick I hadn't touched in months. When he walked through the door, it was like nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek absently, left his suitcase in the hallway, and went straight to his office. No eye contact, no warmth. I watched him from the kitchen. That was the moment I knew we had been over for years, quietly, politely, a life of parallel lines, not cruelty, just absence. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Noah's face, not from that night, but from after. The way he looked at me without expectation, the way he waited for me to decide. I got up, padded down the hall. The house was quiet. Greg's light was still on. I walked past it, out the back door, down the garden path. But the light in the guest house was off. I knocked. Nothing. I opened the door. It was unlocked. The room was empty. The bed, made, the books, gone. Even the small succulent he'd left by the windowsill. On the desk, one thing remained, a folded sheet of paper. I picked it up, hands shaking. It said, "Claire, I thought maybe I was just here to get back on my feet, but then I met you. I don't regret a single thing, not the wine, not the silence, not the look you gave me before you closed your eyes. But I can't stay, not because I want to run, but because I think you need to know if you'll miss me, or if you'll miss the version of yourself you became when I was around. And if it's the latter, then maybe, just maybe, that version still exists, with or without me." Noah. I sat on the edge of his bed and cried, not because I was abandoned, but because he was right. The pain wasn't in losing him. It was in realizing I had been lost for far too long. The next morning, I made coffee, sat across from Greg, watched him scroll his phone. The silence wasn't cruel, just final. And I knew I couldn't go back to pretending. "I'm leaving," I said. He looked up, blinked. "Leaving for work?" I smiled, a sad, clean smile. "No, Greg, I'm leaving us." He said nothing, no fight, no question. He just looked at me and nodded. By noon, I had packed 2 bags. By nightfall, I was driving with the windows down, toward nowhere, toward everything. Somewhere out there, maybe Noah existed, or maybe he was just a mirror. Either way, I was finally choosing me. The town was small, 1 main road, a post office, and a diner that closed at 7. I found a room above a bookshop with creaky floors and windows that overlooked the lake. The landlady, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s, handed me the key without asking questions. That felt like mercy. At night, I would sit by the window with a blanket wrapped around my knees, watching the lights flicker across the water. The air here smelled like pine and possibility. I hadn't spoken Noah's name out loud in weeks, but he lived in the pause between my breaths, not as a person anymore, as a decision, as a voice that whispered, "You were more than someone's wife." I took a job at the bookstore downstairs, nothing glamorous, just sorting old titles, alphabetizing, helping the rare customer who wandered in on a rainy afternoon. There was a slowness to this life that felt like healing. Each morning, I made tea instead of coffee. Each evening, I left the porch light off on purpose. I wasn't waiting anymore. One afternoon, I found a copy of The Little Prince wedged between two travelogues. I hadn't read it in years, but something about it made me pause. The cover was worn like it had passed through too many hands, each one leaving a trace. Inside, on the third page, someone had written in blue ink, "What is essential is invisible to the eye. N.R." I stared at the initials. My breath caught. Was it a coincidence, or had this book followed me the way certain people do, silently, patiently? That night I dreamed of him. He wasn't touching me. He wasn't even speaking. He was just there, in the doorway of the old house, eyes soft, hands in his pockets. Waiting, not for me, but for the version of me that had dared to want more. The next morning, I walked to the edge of the lake. The water was still like glass. I sat for a long time, watching the wind try to ripple the surface. It didn't succeed. And that's when I realized maybe healing wasn't about finding him again. Maybe it was about not needing to. I never intended to write to him. There was no address, no way to know if he was still in the state or even in the country. But on the first real cold day of autumn, I found myself sitting at the small writing desk in my rented room, pen in hand, paper trembling under the weight of what I hadn't said. "Noah, it's strange how silence expands. You left, and the quiet filled every hallway, every coffee cup, every old shirt folded the wrong way. I could say I've moved on, but that wouldn't be true. What I've done is learn how to live alongside the ache. You were not a mistake. You were a moment of clarity in a long, blurred life. I think about the night we shared, not the physical nearness, though that memory is warm. I think about the way you listened, like every word I said had weight. You made me feel like I was still capable of being seen, not as someone's wife, not as someone's burden, but as myself." I stopped writing. The ink had smudged where a tear had fallen. I hadn't even noticed it escape. I could have kept going. I could have poured out everything. But I knew, deep down, that this letter wasn't for him. It was for me. To close a door, not slam it, not lock it, just to gently let it rest. I folded the letter, didn't seal it. I tucked it between the pages of The Little Prince, under the quote he might or might not have scribbled. And then I opened the window, let the wind in, and let the ache go, just a little. There was no music, no thunderclap of closure, just the stillness of knowing I had survived myself. Weeks passed. One day, while shelving new arrivals in the shop, I found a photo tucked between the pages of an old poetry book. It wasn't of Noah, just a shot of a highway stretching toward the mountains, taken from the passenger seat. On the back, someone had written, "You looked like freedom in that morning light." No signature, no explanation. But I smiled, because sometimes not everything has to return to us. Sometimes just once being seen is enough.